Am I still going? Because my Discord disconnected, and that's no good sign. Can somebody save me? Meow, meow.
Of our life is to be improved that is only the merest beginning. So long as so many jobs are an endless for the worker, an aimless routine, a kind of
Is the
automatism
thing
using
back?
one set of muscles in one monotonous pattern, his whole life will tend towards an automatism in which nothing is particularly to be distinguished from anything else unless it is announced with a thunderclap. So long as he is physically imprisoned in crowds by day and even by night, his attention will flicker and relax. It will not hold fast and define clearly where he is the victim of all sorts of pother, in a home which needs to be ventilated of its welter of drudgery, shrieking children, raucous assertions, indigestible food, bad air, and suffocating ornament. Occasionally perhaps we enter a building which is composed and spacious, we go to a theater where modern stagecraft has cut away distraction, or go to sea, or into a quiet place, and we remember how cluttered, how capricious, how superfluous and clamorous is the ordinary urban life of our time. We learn to understand why our addled minds see so little with precision, why they are caught up and tossed about in a kind of tarantella by headlines and catchwords, why so often they cannot tell things apart or discern identity in apparent differences. 5. But this external disorder is complicated further by internal. Experiment shows that the speed, the accuracy, and the intellectual quality of association is deranged by what we are taught to call emotional conflicts. Measured in fifths of a second, a series of 100 stimuli containing both neutral and hot words may show a variation as between 5 and 32 or even a total failure to respond at all. Obviously our public opinion is in intermittent contact with complexes of all sorts, with ambition and economic interest, personal animosity, racial prejudice, class feeling and whatnot. They distort our reading, our thinking, our talking and our behavior in a great variety of ways. And finally, since opinions do not stop at the normal members of society, since for the purposes of an election, a propaganda, a following numbers constitute power, the quality of attention is still further depressed. The mass of absolutely illiterate, of feeble-minded, grossly neurotic, undernourished and frustrated individuals, is very considerable, much more considerable there is reason to think than we generally suppose. Thus a wide popular appeal is circulated among persons who are mentally children or barbarians, people whose lives are a morass of entanglements, people whose vitality is exhausted, shut-in people, and people whose experience has comprehended no factor in the problem under discussion. The stream of public opinion is stopped by them in little eddies of misunderstanding, where it is discolored with prejudice and far-fetched analogy. A broad appeal takes account of the quality of association, and is made to those susceptibilities which are widely distributed. A narrow or a special appeal is one made to those susceptibilities which are uncommon. But the same individual may respond with very different quality to different stimuli, or to the same stimuli at different times. Human susceptibilities are like an alpine country. There are isolated peaks, there are extensive but separated plateaus, and there are deeper strata which are quite continuous for nearly all mankind. Thus the individuals whose susceptibilities reach the rarefied atmosphere of those peaks where there exists an exquisitive difference between Frege and Piano, or between earlier and later periods, may be good staunch Republicans at another level of appeal, and when they are starving and afraid, indistinguishable from any other starving and frightened person. No wonder that the magazines with the large circulations prefer the face of a pretty girl to any other trademark, a face, pretty enough to be alluring, but innocent enough to be acceptable. For the psychic level on which the stimulus acts determines whether the public is to be potentially a large or a small one. 6. Thus the environment with which our public opinions deal is refracted in many ways, by censorship and privacy at the source, by physical and social barriers at the other end, by scanty attention, by the poverty of language, by distraction, by unconscious constellations of feeling, by wear and tear, violence, monotony. These limitations upon our access to that environment combine with the obscurity and complexity of the facts themselves to thwart clearness and justice of perception, to substitute misleading fictions for workable ideas, and to deprive us of adequate checks upon those who consciously strive to mislead. Part 3. Stereotypes. Chapter 6. Stereotypes. 1. Each of us lives and works on a small part of the Earth's surface, moves in a small circle, and of these acquaintances knows only a few intimately. Of any public event that has wide effects we see at best only a phase and an aspect. This is as true of the eminent insiders who draft treaties, make laws, and issue orders, as it is of those who have treaties framed for them, laws promulgated to them, orders given at them. Inevitably our opinions cover a bigger space, a longer reach of time, a greater number of things, than we can directly observe. They have, therefore, to be pieced together out of what others have reported and what we can imagine. Yet even the eyewitness does not bring back a naive picture of the scene. For experience seems to show that he himself brings something to the scene which later he takes away from it, that oftener than not what he imagines to be the account of an event is really a transfiguration of it. Few facts in consciousness seem to be merely given. Most facts in consciousness seem to be partly made. A report is the joint product of the knower and known, in which the role of the observer is always selective and usually creative. The facts we see depend on where we are placed, and the habits of our eyes. An unfamiliar scene is like the baby's world, one great, blooming, buzzing confusion. This is the way, says Mr. John Dewey, that any new thing strikes an adult, so far as the thing is really new and strange. Foreign languages that we do not understand always seem gibberings, babblings, in which it is impossible to fix a definite, clear-cut, individualized group of sounds. The countryman in the crowded street, the landlubber at sea, the ignoramus in sport at a contest between experts in a complicated game, are further instances. Put an inexperienced man in a factory, and at first the work seems to him a meaningless medley. All strangers of another race proverbially look alike to the visiting stranger. Only gross differences of size or color are perceived by an outsider in a flock of sheep, each of which is perfectly individualized to the shepherd. A diffusive blur and an indiscriminately shifting suction characterize what we do not understand. The problem of the acquisition of meaning by things, or, stated in another way, of forming habits of simple apprehension, is thus the problem of introducing 1. Definiteness and distinction and 2. Consistency or stability of meaning into what is otherwise vague and wavering. But the kind of definiteness and consistency introduced depends upon who introduces them. In a later passage Dewey gives an example of how differently an experienced layman and a chemist might define the word metal. Smoothness, hardness, glossiness, and brilliancy, heavy weight for its size, the serviceable properties of capacity for being hammered and pulled without breaking, of being softened by heat and hardened by cold, of retaining the shape and form given, of resistance to pressure and decay, would probably be included in the layman's definition. But the chemist would likely as not ignore these aesthetic and utilitarian qualities, and define a metal as a chemical element that enters into combination with oxygen so as to form a base. For the most part we do not first see, and then define, we define first and then see. In the great blooming, buzzing confusion of the outer world we pick out what our culture has all. For the most part we do not first see, and then define. We define first and then see. In the great blooming, buzzing confusion of the outer world we pick out what our culture has already defined for us, and we tend to perceive that which we have picked out in the form stereotyped for us by our culture. Of the great men who assembled at Paris to settle the affairs of mankind, how many were there who were able to see much of the Europe about them, rather than their commitments about Europe? Could anyone have penetrated the mind of M. Clemenceau, would he have found there images of the Europe of 1919, or a great sediment of stereotyped ideas accumulated and hardened in a long and pugnacious existence? Did he see the Germans of 1919, or the German type as he had learned to see it since 1871? He saw the type, and among the reports that came to him from Germany, he took to heart those reports, and, it seems, those only, which fitted the type that was in his mind. If a Junker blustered, that was an authentic German. If a labor leader confessed the guilt of the empire, he was not an authentic German. At a Congress of Psychology in Göttingen an interesting experiment was made with a crowd of presumably trained observers. Not far from the hall in which the Congress was sitting there was a public fete with a masked ball. Suddenly the door of the hall was thrown open and a clown rushed in madly pursued by a Negro, revolver in hand. They stopped in the middle of the room fighting. The clown fell, the Negro leapt upon him, fired, and then both rushed out of the hall. The whole incident hardly lasted 20 seconds. The president asked those present to write immediately a report since there was sure to be a judicial inquiry. 40 reports were sent in. Only one had less than 20% of mistakes in regard to the principal facts, 14 had 20% to 40% of mistakes, 12 from 40% to 50%, 13 more than 50%. Moreover, in 24 accounts 10% of the details were pure inventions and this proportion was exceeded in 10 accounts and diminished in 6. Briefly, a quarter of the accounts were false. It goes without saying that the whole scene had been arranged and even photographed in advance. The 10 false reports may then be relegated to the category of tales and legends, 24 accounts are half legendary, and 6 have a value approximating to exact evidence. Thus, out of 40 trained observers writing a responsible account of a scene that had just happened before their eyes, more than a majority saw a scene that had not taken place. What then did they see? One would suppose it was easier to tell what had occurred, than to invent something which had not occurred. They saw their stereotype of such a brawl. All of them had in the course of their lives acquired a series of images of brawls, and these images flickered before their eyes. In one man these images displaced less than 20% of the actual scene, in 13 men more than half. In 34 out of the 40 observers the stereotypes preempted at least 1/10 of the scene. A distinguished art critic has said that what with the almost numberless shapes assumed by an object, what with our insensitiveness and inattention, things scarcely would have for us features and outlines so determined and clear that we could recall them at will, but for the stereotyped shapes art has lent them. The truth is even broader than that, for the stereotyped shapes lent to the world come not merely from art, in the sense of painting and sculpture and literature, but from our moral codes and our social philosophies and our political agitations as well. Substitute in the following passage of Mr. Berenson's the words politics, business, and society, for the word art, and sentences will be no less true. Unless years devoted to the study of all schools of art have taught us also to see with our own eyes, we soon fall into the habit of molding whatever we look at into the forms borrowed from the one art with which we are acquainted. There is our standard of artistic reality. Let anyone give us shapes and colors which we cannot instantly match in our paltry stock of hackneyed forms and tints, and we shake our heads at his failure to reproduce things as we know they certainly are, or we accuse him of insincerity. Mr. Berenson speaks of our displeasure when a painter does not visualize objects
Shrimp pie
exactly as we do,
subsiop.
and of the difficulty of appreciating the art of the Middle Ages because since then our
Hey.
manner of visualizing
Back.
forms has changed in 1,000 ways. He goes on to show how in regard to the human figure we have been taught to see what we do see. Created by Donatello and Masaccio, and sanctioned by the humanists, the new canon of the human figure, the new cast of features, presented to the ruling classes of that time the type of human being most likely to win the day in the combat of human forces. Who had the power to break through this new standard of vision and, out of the chaos of things, to select shapes more definitely expressive of reality than those fixed by men of genius? No one had such power. People had perforce to see things in that way and in no other, and to see only the shapes depicted, to love only the ideals presented. 2. If we cannot fully understand the acts of other people, until we know what they think they know, then in order to do justice we have to appraise not only the information which has been at their disposal, but the minds through which they have filtered it. For the accepted types, the current patterns, the standard versions intercept information on its way to consciousness. Americanization, for example, is superficially at least the substitution of American for European stereotypes. Thus the peasant who might see his landlord as if he were the lord of the manor, his employer as he saw the local magnate, is taught by Americanization to see the landlord and employer according to American standards. This constitutes a change of mind, which is, in effect, when the inoculation succeeds, a change of vision. His eye sees differently. One kindly gentlewoman has confessed that the stereotypes are of such overweening importance, that when hers are not indulged, she at least is unable to accept the brotherhood of man and the fatherhood of God. We are strangely affected by the clothes we wear. Garments create a mental and social atmosphere. What can be hoped for the Americanism of a man who insists on employing a London tailor? One's very food affects his Americanism. What kind of American consciousness can grow in the atmosphere of sauerkraut and Limburger cheese? Or what can you expect of the Americanism of the man whose breath always reeks of garlic? This lady might well have been the patron of a pageant which a friend of mine once attended. It was called the Melting Pot, and it was given on the 4th of July in an automobile town where many foreign-born workers are employed. In the center of the baseball park at second base stood a huge wooden and canvas pot. There were flights of steps up to the rim on two sides. After the audience had settled itself, and the band had played, a procession
Shrimp pie
came through an
subsiop.
opening at one side of the field.
I'm
It
marking a
was made up
Samick
of men of all
Negi.
the foreign nationalities employed in the factories. They wore their native costumes,
What kind of
they
thing?
were singing their national songs, they danced their folk dances, and carried the banners of all Europe. The master of ceremonies was the principal of the grade school dressed as Uncle Sam. He led them to the pot. He directed them up the steps to the rim, and inside. He called them out again on the other side. They came, dressed in derby hats, coats, pants, vest, stiff collar and polka dot tie, undoubtedly, said my friend, each with an ever-sharp pencil in his pocket, and all singing the Star-Spangled Banner. To the promoters of this pageant, and probably to most of the actors, it seemed as if they had managed to express the most intimate difficulty to friendly association between the older peoples of America and the newer. The contradiction of their stereotypes interfered with the full recognition of their common humanity. The people who change their names know this. They mean to change themselves, and the attitude of strangers toward them. There is, of course, some connection between the scene outside and the mind through which we watch it, just as there are some long-haired men and short-haired women in radical gatherings. But to the hurried observer a slight connection is enough. If there are 2 bobbed heads and 4 beards in the audience, it will be a bobbed and bearded audience to the reporter who knows beforehand that such gatherings are composed of people with these tastes in the management of their hair. There is a connection between our vision and the facts, but it is often a strange connection. A man has rarely looked at a landscape, let us say, except to examine its possibilities for division into building lots, but he has seen a number of landscapes hanging in the parlor. And from them he has learned to think of a landscape as a rosy sunset, or as a country road with a church steeple and a silver moon. One day he goes to the country, and for hours he does not see a single landscape. Then the sun goes down looking rosy. At once he recognizes a landscape and exclaims that it is beautiful. But 2 days later, when he tries to recall what he saw, the odds are that he will remember chiefly some landscape.
Fuck, they really got this chat on lock as far as any misspelling of the N-word.
Oh yeah, YouTube. No fucking doubt. No fun allowed over here. I mean, you could go head over to Kick and try that. Did you guys know I also stream on Kick?
See a sunset, but he saw in it, and above all remembers from it, more of what the oil painting taught him to observe, than what an impressionist painter, for example, or a cultivated Japanese would have seen and taken away with him. And the Japanese and the painter in turn will have seen and remembered more of the form they had learned, unless they happen to be the very rare people who find fresh sight for mankind. In untrained observation we pick recognizable signs out of the environment. The signs stand for ideas, and these ideas we fill out with our stock of
Kick
images.
link.
We do not so much see this man and
how's it going, Alchemy? Where is the Kick? What's that? How's it going, mate? There you go. Now, obviously, Kick is meant to be just more or less a Twitch. Oh, for fuck's sake, does it ban my... Oh, God, I was about to say, I thought it just fucking banned my own goddamn post. It's like, really? You're gonna prevent me from fucking putting a link in my goddamn chat? Yeah, for what I understand, Kick is just meant to be a Twitch clone, but obviously it doesn't have a ton of automated systems, so, you know, just don't make too much noise, you pop up on the radar. Fly low.
and that sunset, rather we notice that the thing is man or sunset, and then see chiefly what our mind is already full of on those subjects. 3.
Shrimp eye subsidiary.
There is economy in this.
Don't kick link. He didn't do anything wrong.
Rather than as types and generalities, is exhausting.
I know what he did with Zelda.
Practically out of the question. In a circle of friends, and in relation to close associates or competitors, there is no shortcut through, and no substitute for, an individualized understanding. Those whom we love and admire most are the men and women whose consciousness is peopled thickly with persons rather than with types, who know us rather than the classification into which we might fit. For even without phrasing it to ourselves, we feel intuitively that all classification is in relation to some purpose not necessarily our own, that between two human beings no association has final dignity in which each does not take the other as an end in himself. There is a taint on any contact between two people which does not affirm as an axiom the personal inviolability of both. But modern life is hurried and multifarious, above all physical distance separates men who are often in vital contact with each other, such as employer and employee, official and voter. There is neither time nor opportunity for intimate acquaintance. Instead we notice a trait which marks a well-known type, and fill in the rest of the picture by means of the stereotypes we carry about in our heads. He is an agitator. That much we notice, or are told. Well, an agitator is this sort of person, and so he is this sort of person. He is an intellectual.
Shrimp eye subsidiary.
He is a plutocrat.
Nintendo porn has made me hate every video game princess.
He is from Back Bay.
They're all hoes.
How different from the statement. He is a Yale man. He is a...
You don't deserve Link, Zelda. You whore, I saw you with Ganon. And you, Peach, huh? What you don't you find it awfully convenient that she never builds an army, huh? She always ends up getting kidnapped, but she never ends up getting hurt or anything, huh?
See it. We imagine most things before we experience them. And those preconceptions, unless education has made us acutely aware, govern deeply the whole process of perception. They mark out certain objects as familiar or strange, emphasizing the difference, so that the slightly familiar is seen as very familiar, and the somewhat strange as sharply alien. They are
Shrimp
aroused by small
subsidiary.
signs, which may vary from a true
Unironically,
index to a
yes.
vague analogy. Aroused, they flood fresh vision with older images, and project into the world what has been resurrected in memory. Were there no practical uniformities in the environment, there would be no economy and only error in the human habit of accepting foresight for sight. But there are uniformities sufficiently accurate, and the need of economizing attention is so inevitable, that the abandonment of all stereotypes for a wholly innocent approach to experience would impoverish human life. What matters is the character of the stereotypes, and the gullibility with which we employ them. And these in the end depend upon those inclusive patterns which constitute our philosophy of life. In that philosophy we assume that the world is codified according to a code which we possess,